We are your home theater and AV questions answered. This is AVRant. Want your home theater or AV question answered by Tom and Rob? Send it to question@avrant.com. Welcome to this special edition of AVRant. I'm Tom Andry, and I'm here with
Rob H. This is AVRant. It's your home theater and AV questions answered, but today we are doing an interview episode, so it's our questions answered by an expert.
Right. That's right.
What's happening?
You'll soon be meeting, I already miss him because we just finished the interview, Jason Ehrlich from Kinetics Noise Control, Inc. I'll mess his name up again later. Don't worry. I'm consistent. So Jason he's going to tell us all about it, but he's an expert over there, and their company deals with soundproofing and mostly soundproofing, I feel like. But they also do a lot of room treatments, and they have a lot of products that deal with that. But they do everything from the commercial to everything else. So we know that you have questions about soundproofing. Everybody wants it, but nobody really knows what it is. And when we tell them what it is, they think, they're just making that up. So we've got an expert here to confirm, hopefully, that we do know what we're talking about. So,
or at least pointing people in the right direction. That's our main goal. Tom and I are not engineers, but the idea is to get within the ballpark and the realm of the correct concepts, but to get into more of the specifics, to talk about what products you're going to need, how they're going to need to be deployed, a little bit of how they were developed, because a lot of what Kinetics is doing, the reason that they're able to expand and address the home market, which is an area where they're starting to grow now, is because they're coming from the commercial side of things, as you'll hear Jason describe. So they've got that background, really having to deliver results for commercial clients when it comes to mitigating vibration, mitigating outside noise, mitigating noise that they're producing from getting outside of their facilities. So taking all of those concepts, and what we're trying to do is bring that to the home market and bring it specifically to the home theater market, where of course we're concerned about those very same things.
So if you are new to the AVRant podcast, we are a question and answer podcast, which means our listeners send us questions and we answer them. It's a tough concept to wrap your head around, but we answer everything that comes about home
first
theater.
First in, first out.
That's right. So we get questions from, which cable do I need to plug my phone into my receiver, to I have an empty basement that is down to the studs. Where do I start?
Or I'm building a house from the ground up. We've had that.
Or my favorite one, I'm buying a house.
Yes.
This one might be it. I think this might be the room. Look at the pictures on Zillow and tell me what I should do.
That's right.
The whole 9 yards. So if you're new and you're interested in getting your question answered here, all you have to do is ask, and you ask by emailing us at question@avrant.com. So we have a bunch of other contact information. You can find our website, avrant.com, where you can listen to our past episodes, as well as each episode has show notes with timestamps, as well as a Flickr album, because a lot of people send us pictures so that we can understand what the heck they're talking about when they say, oh, I've got this room. So we've got Flickr albums for each episode that show you what we're looking at as we are talking about each person's question. You can contact us or look us up on Facebook.com/AVRant podcast. Each of our recording sessions, because Rob's in Canada and I'm in Florida, we contact each other over Skype. So we record those sessions because we might as well, and we slap them up on YouTube, youtube.com/AVRant.
That's it. That one's the short one. YouTube.com/AVRant. And
I don't know why I didn't put.
That's a great way to see what we're talking about too. If you're worried about talking about any images for this very podcast, this interview episode with Jason Ehrlich from Kinetics Noise Control. If you'd like to see images of many of the things that we're talking about, we're going to run through a PowerPoint presentation that he had prepared. So if you want to be able to see all that, YouTube.com/AVRant, and you can see exactly what we were looking at.
That's right. But like I said, if you're new and you want to get your question answered, first in, first out, unless we have an email glitch like we did a couple of weeks ago, question@avrant.com. So without further ado, let's get on to the interview. Good afternoon, everybody. Let's welcome Jason Ehrlich. Ehrlich? I don't know if I'm going to say it right. Ehrlich, right?
Ehrlich, yep.
Ehrlich. Jason Ehrlich from Kinetics Noise Control, Inc. to the podcast. Welcome, Jason.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Well, let's just start, since I can't even say your name right. Let's go ahead and start with you introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about your position with Kinetics and about the company.
Well, because it's maybe a little bit of an unusual journey in today's day and age, Kinetics was my first and only interview out of college way back in 1999. My degree is actually in operations, so I was actually hired in here as our production scheduler, and that position lasted 3 whole months before our purchasing person left. So there goes my degree, right into the purchasing group. Did that for a couple years, then moved into sales on our commercial noise control side, and that's where I learned a lot of my acoustics that I know, because I was the point contact for consultants, acoustical consultants, architects, contractors, our reps, and engineering, just making sure that that design was put in place properly, installed properly, all that fun stuff. From there, I moved into a marketing role with our commercial noise control divisions, as well as our room acoustic side. And then after that, my current role, my title sales development on really special projects for our commercial room acoustics, as well as our home residential side of things.
Is really special projects, is that the actual title? Really
no,
special?
My title's it's sales development, and it's more like you don't know where to put the misfit toy.
All right,
kind of thing. And because I do a lot of this stuff, I go out and educate architects. I write a lot of literature. I'm the point person for acoustics in a couple divisions. So they just threw sales development, because that is what I do ultimately.
Right.
Is to bring people here. That's the idea anyway.
So Kinetics Noise Control as a company, it's a name that was introduced to us by one of our AVRant listeners who was interested in some of the internal room acoustics products, but we weren't super duper familiar with it. However, you really kindly reached out to us in an email, I think having heard Kinetics Noise Control mentioned on the podcast. So I think it would be beneficial, certainly to Tom and I know for sure, but hopefully to our wider audience, to learn a little bit more about the company itself, what you're involved in,
Sure.
And since we are obviously sort of focused on the home theater side of things, how Kinetics Noise Control relates to home theaters specifically.
Sure. So our biggest claim to fame is that we manufacture more different types of acoustical noise control, vibration control products than anybody else on Earth, actually. Our biggest division is vibration isolation for HVAC equipment. So if you're ever in a hotel and you look down, you see all the air handlers on top of a roof, you see it on blue curves with springs, that's probably one of our isolators. That's our biggest division. Our next 2 biggest divisions are that commercial noise control that I mentioned earlier, and that's basically quiet floors, walls, and ceilings, just trying to prevent sound from going from one space into another. The room acoustic side, it's the quality of the sound in that space. That's what that division concentrates on. We also have an industrial environmental division, and they do things like HVAC silencers, industrial curtains, and anything in that realm. And then we have the home group, which is one of our smaller sizes, but the benefit we have is all those technologies from all those different groups can pour. And the home market is really the only market we have that can sell any product. It's all about application. So if you need your HVAC equipment quieted, we can help with that. You need silencers, we can do that. Anything, as well as our own technology too. Some of these specialized panels were developed in that home market. So between that and the fact that we have to have professional engineers on staff, that really does let our home group do things that no other group could do if they were just in this realm of things. They would go out of business, frankly, if they had the overhead we have, but we get to share that cost with the commercial group. So that's a big benefit to anybody listening in who might be working on a theater project.
Okay, so before we're going to go into some of the specific questions we have for you about soundproofing, sound isolation, and curtains, because that's a big one that I have. We always want people to tell us about their home theaters or their sound systems or whatever they have going on in their house. And there's no judgment here. We don't care what you have. We just want to know what it is so we can talk about it behind your back.
Sure. So, well, after about a 3-year search, I finally found, the house that I will at least hopefully take me through into retirement. And I just moved in last August. So I have 2,100 square feet of unfinished basement. That's just the dream is going to happen. But right now, I just have my old setup. It's a little bit boring. I have a Yamaha RX 2010. If you remember that one, it was obviously not 4K, but a 9.2 system. It's nice, and I'm running Paradigm Monitor 7s are my main speakers in that. And at this point in time, it's just hooked up to a first or second gen Samsung 46-inch high def or 4K television sitting in a raw basement. Kinetics actually does have a partnership with Butt Kicker, so I do have that system hooked up. Again, it's fun. It's fun. I guess I'll put it there.
The fact that you can muster that much excitement about butt kickers, I feel is evident that you were on their payroll.
I always love that. I always love that whenever we have a guest on who's a little bit more like engineering inclined, the sound system is always something that we're going like, that's really reasonable. That's really down down the middle choice. You didn't go crazy esoteric, although who knows what you'll do in your upcoming system that you're building from the ground up. But we have an inclination. So yeah, you gave a great introduction on Kinetics overall. We are going to start by talking about the products that are in that home and home theater section. For anyone who's coming over to kineticsnoise.com, which is the website, you'll see there is a home and home theater section right there on the splash page right at the beginning. So maybe you can talk us through basically just sort of going through the products that are a part of that specific section of the website. And then if we have time, we'll open up into the rest of the things there as well as they might apply.
Sure. Well, and it would be product overload because, as I mentioned, we can pull from all these different groups. And there's several things that aren't on our website, like subwoofer isolation for the most part. But we do try to keep it simple, and we do break it into the two categories of noise control versus room acoustics to try to make it a little bit simpler. And honestly, I would say right now our website's not necessarily focused on the end user. It's more support for the dealer and rep network. That's going to change. I can tell you that. That's on my agenda to change that. We are going to start focusing on the end user because we are showing up more and more. I think people are realizing that acoustics are important to home theater, that you don't want to hear the room. That's kind of one of our lines goes. So in so much as that, you're going to see on our room acoustic side of things, different panels, different types of panels that are designed to do different things. Our approach is always what's in that room, so we can kind of look at that from a frequency standpoint and then balance that out with the right types of absorption. Don't get hung up on what they look like, because they're either going to be a fabric wrap panel or they're going to have a stretch fabric over top of them, or they might be a wood product, but the looks are important. Everybody's going to go aesthetics first. They always do. But we'll worry about the acoustics behind what it looks like. You tell us what you want it to look like, and we'll make it sound really well. And so those are those types of products that are on that side of things. On the noise control side, you're going to see really to just kind of give an instant kind of look as to how that works. If there's a solid wall between you and me and I'm talking, that airborne sound of my voice has to become structure-borne when it hits that first layer of drywall. Then it's going to turn back into airborne noise, hit that second layer of drywall, and then become structure-borne, and then break back out again as airborne noise. What we're doing is basically breaking that rigid connection between that drywall and, in this case, studs. So generally speaking, if you put something squishy in that construction, that's a technical term I use, it's going to work. And usually the squishier it is, the better it's going to work, into the lower frequency it's going to work. So all those products are going to be designed around something squishy. And then we have accessory things like doors, duct silencers, HVAC equipment, and curtains for Well, we'll talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, certainly one of the reasons that we were happy to talk to you and very glad that you reached out, looking through those products that are listed there. I mean, it's in this hobby, when we're talking specifically home theater and audiophile things, we'll see a lot of things that are claimed as being room acoustics or soundproofing control that we would say are completely outside of actual scientific rigor and correctness. But looking through this, I mean, even if we look into the commercial product side of the things, which are obviously dealing with larger rooms and larger and heavier structures, it's the basic idea behind pretty much all of the soundproofing products that I'm seeing from Kinetics are the idea of a shock absorber. For the most part, it's some type of shock absorption, be that a spring-loaded structure or, like you say, simply something squishy. So, in concept, soundproofing doesn't have to be ridiculous, right? It's a relatively simple concept, but then it's the actual execution of it that takes calculation and careful planning.
Yeah, and that's the devil is in the details. They've done studies where if you isolate a wall and you have as few as 6 errant screws that make a rigid contact between the drywall and say your stud underneath there, that you might as well not have put the product in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other thing people don't understand, especially when it comes to noise control, it is the composite. The composite's what matter. And when I say composite, I mean the building materials, the airspace between is critical, and then the product as well. In fact, what we're doing is making air the actual isolator, not our product. Our products are just not a rigid connection. Yeah. They're less bad than a screw, basically.
Providing the opportunity for there to be a mechanical separation.
I don't think people understand that. They sell their products as, oh, use our product, it does this. And really, it's really the whole construction you got to look at.
Right. When you take a squishy product and you put it between 2 layers of drywall, but then you screw into the drywall so that the product essentially is compressed. They're like, I don't understand why this isn't working. Well, you compress the squishiness out of it, and now it's a rigid connection again, or it's not as squishy as it should be. What we always tell people on this podcast is soundproofing is like, think of it less like trying to keep sound out and more like trying to keep water in the room.
Absolutely.
If you can keep the water in the room all the way to the top without it getting out anywhere, then you have fulfilled the soundproofing ideal. If there's one place where the water can get out, then you've no longer soundproofed that room, and that sort of helps people. But we're going to get more onto this in just a little bit here. But the common question we receive and we see all the time online, and I literally saw it yesterday when I was browsing Reddit, was somebody was saying, I've got this basement and I'm going to put a home theater on this side and the game room on the other and a curtain in between to keep the sound out. I'm like, really? You're going to put a bouncer there too? Because that's what it's going to take. So tell us about curtains, man. Let's talk about soundproofing and curtains.
So we get a lot of phone calls about curtains, and in our world, curtain is not what people are thinking. In our world, a curtain is an industrial curtain. It's a gray vinyl with mass-loaded vinyl inside of it.
Sure.
That typically is either 1 pound per square foot or 2 pounds per square foot. And in general, I would tell you that mass-loaded vinyl can be effective. It's also probably the most expensive way to possibly do noise control. And it's also, because it's so stiff, I mean, it's a thick product. You're not going to sew that into a curtain with fabric and be able to pull it across. And even if you could, you better make sure you have a perfect seal, because as you were alluding to water, the water is going to gush all around the edges of that curtain.
So Tom and I aren't aware of a way to take the opening between a kitchen and a dining room, big opening in a house, and just, have that magically turn into a sound barrier. We aren't aware of a way to do it. We'd love to be wrong about that, but we're not sure if there's anything you can say on that front to help or at least let people know that Tom and Rob are kind of on the money on that one.
You're certainly not wrong. About the only thing you can do is just quiet the overall space in with absorptive products. But that's all you're doing is making the overall levels come down a little bit. That's not all you can do.
Okay. Really quickly before we go on to the next section, a question that actually popped into mind going back to the everything being a shock absorber thing. Again, in the audiophile world, there's this thing of let's put spikes on the bottom of subwoofers and speakers. Can you please, from an expert's mouth, say that is not decoupling or damping to have spikes on the bottom?
Yeah, honestly, that's the number. My favorite thing is when people buy giant subwoofers and then they call us up to say, "Hey, can you isolate the subwoofer?" I'm like, "But you paid for it to make your room shake."
Yes.
So if you want your room to, we can isolate it. Sure, we're not going to stop that 20 hertz wave from going through a wall. You understand that, right? We're not going to magically make that sound stop. Nothing can do that. No, spikes are still touching. Now you might make an argument the way they design their cabinet, that putting it on certain points is going to make that cabinet resonate a little differently. I would entertain that argument, but from a noise control standpoint, spikes are not isolating.
Very good. So looking at the portfolio of products that we do have there at Kinetics, as far as room treatments go, we do see that there's like what you've got your stretch track system and things that are listed as acoustical wood. Also, there's ones that I have like art printed on it, the acoustic graphics panels and that. So, clearly, as you touched upon, aesthetics are something that is asked about by customers. We were curious, like how much of Kinetics' own time and from your own employees and representatives is actually more about educating your clients as opposed to just doing the install or like literally just doing what they said. How much of it is having to have that conversation where you go, okay, we get where you're coming from, but here's the information that you actually need to get where you want to go.
You dropped out on
sorry,
me.
it's Skype. But I think you got the gist of the question.
Yeah, we get two different kinds of customers that we talk to. Ones that find us because they know they have an acoustic problem, and those that the dealer might push our way because they need to talk to us, and we're going to have to do a lot of educating on that. We have dealers that their whole style is to talk about the finish and work it back. They don't even talk about acoustics. They say, what do you want it to look like? I'll take care of what it sounds like. We do a fair amount of education, but it's kind of interesting. On the commercial side of things, I spend a great deal of my time convincing experts why, on a somewhat molecular level, our noise control does work. Where on the home side, it's more pretty much, this stuff works great. And it's unfortunate for us that works so well, because a lot of people can say that and can't back it up. But there's not a whole lot of time. They don't really want to know the magic. It's really convincing them they're going to have a problem and understanding the problem. And really that interview with them is, what are you trying to achieve? And then we can work out what level we need to go to and see if those things can all jive.
So obviously, you work through dealers, and I know that there's pricing structures and stuff, how that works. But you guys do or don't sell directly to customers?
So it is going to kind of depend where you're at, because we have different reps that are better at some things than others. Your orders even if we have places where we don't have a rep, you're going to work with us directly. Usually we're approached by a dealer, but sometimes we do get homeowners calling out to us directly. But I'd be amiss if, I know y'all are up in Canada. Our Canadian rep, Watershed, right outside Toronto, really, really, really well educated, really takes our stuff seriously, has inventory. If you call them up, they're going to do that interview, like, what are you trying to achieve? And they're going to probably push you onto a dealer that's going to be right for what you need, be it an installation for the noise control materials or just the room treatment side. I really do appreciate their approach up there. So it does kind of depend. We will sell direct when it makes sense. It really depends on what level they're trying to do. The one thing I would say for your audience of the do-it-yourselfers, if you want to save the most money possible, do your best to try to, if you're the kind of do-it-yourselfer that gets into this, try to figure out your bill of material and approach it that way, because the last thing a dealer or a rep wants to get into is a 4-hour discussion of how to lay out your theater. We realize it's important to you, and we realize you want to have that conversation. I'm just, and they'll have that conversation. I'm just saying you'll probably do yourself a favor from a price standpoint if you say, I'm just looking for this.
Right.
Well, speaking of pricing, we're aware that, I mean, since it isn't like go to your website and add to cart, it's not that type of selling direct to consumers. I mean, we understand it's going to be going through dealers, so there's going to be dealer pricing there, and we're not going to do specifics, but we wanted to get, if you're able to, just a ballpark idea. I mean, more on the like acoustic treatment side of things, you know, because we talk about companies on AVRant that do just have add to cart on their website, and we're just wondering, where does Kinetics fall? Is it going to be you know, similar pricing, less, 10x, you know, just to get a ballpark figure what we're dealing with?
Well, the beauty, or maybe not beauty, depending on how you want to look at it, is, I mean, if you want to do a true apples to apples comparison, and that would be our basic 6 pound per cubic foot fiberglass panel that frankly is good for voices, not so much the kind of thing you want to stick in a home theater environment. But this is the product that everybody has. Everybody on the internet has. You can buy it direct from the internet. That's probably going to come down to shipping. If you're close to Central Ohio, we probably are going to be quite competitive. If we're shipping to Vancouver, not so much. You know, we do have a big overhead here. So we're, generally speaking, we're not necessarily going to be the least expensive, especially on those commodity type products. What we do bring to the table, though, are things, because we're a manufacturer, because we have presses, because we can make these custom panels with different composites that do different things. There is no apples to apples comparison. Right. So a lot of times it's really just trying to explain that value to people.
Well, I mean,
so what?
Just put another way, we've seen panels that are essentially just fiberglass insulation bats, and then being sold for $700-800. And so, I mean, what you're saying, I'm thinking it's not going to be like that, because when we look at those prices, we go, that doesn't line up. You know, just the bill of materials doesn't line up with that type of pricing, but it's being targeted at maybe someone who doesn't know. So we're happy to hear that Kinetics is not going to be in that type of what we would call overpriced price range.
No.
So one question, I mean, a lot of people contact us because, as you know, our podcast is a question and answer. So we get questions from our listeners and we answer them. And many of them start off from, I want to soundproof my home theater. And we're like, no, you don't, because you have no idea how much money this is going to cost. And honestly, we don't really know either, because it really involves so many things. But for example, if you were to, like, you have a finished or unfinished basement that you, in the house you just moved into, if you have a room like that, how much would somebody expect to pay per square foot, if you can, like ballpark, to soundproof a room of that is essentially a room in the house that has a door and that's it? Do you have an idea of how much that would cost?
So, and I'll go through some numbers. I'm not trying to. The problem is a lot of these things, like these isolators, are done in an array.
Yes.
And if you've got a large rectangle, you get a lot of square feet of, say, ceiling per isolator. But if you've got one that's got a lot of jigs and jogs and all these things, your price per isolator per square foot is going to go way, way, way up.
Sure.
So it's not like we're necessarily trying to dodge the question, but I have worked up some just general pricing, and I would call this a worst case scenario. Great. This is a very inefficient layout kind of thing. So if you were doing our best ceiling isolation, for example, and that uses a 1-inch coil. So I kind of explain that that's your Cadillac suspension. You know, you think if you use the word suspension, that's a very good word. It is a 1-inch deflection coil. That's the full frequency that will go down 3 hertz, and it's a full 1-inch deflection. You are looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe $10-11 per square foot for the hangers and the design. That doesn't include the drywall. That doesn't include the steel channel that's got to go through there. And again, that should hopefully be a nice budget price. It should not be more than that. And hopefully you'll do a better layout than what I'm trying to give you the example of. Now, if you compare that to, you know, we can do that with just little isolation clips that price can go all the way down to, say, $5 a square foot, depending on what you're trying to do. So even inside our good, better, best range, you can see there's a lot of variation. Generally speaking, if you're going to hire a contractor to do this, the difference between good and best to us per square foot isn't necessarily as bad as bringing that contractor in to put the drywall up and do all that. Is generally speaking, it's as a per square foot cost. That's not the hard part.
Well, that's great. We sort of debated amongst ourselves, Tom and I, about what was going to be the best way to approach trying to dig into the questions that we get frequently. We're going to start on the soundproofing and construction side of things, and you really helped us out because when we mentioned that, that's just a topic we wanted to ask about, you go, hey, wait a second, Kinetics has a PowerPoint presentation about a real life project that was done that, for Tom and I, when we looked at it, we're like, this is pretty much an all-out, like all the things that could be done. Not maybe not the very most expensive, but getting pretty close to it. So we thought, okay, we could have started at the least expensive and worked our way up, or we can start at sort of the most expensive and work our way down. And since this PowerPoint exists, that's what we're going to try and do. So maybe you can run through some of the details that went into this. I think you said in your own email it was a pretty high budget project. This is certainly not a scrimp and save. So why don't we have a look at that?
Yeah, this is a project actually up in Canada where the house was literally 80 feet away from a train track, and they said, we don't want to, it's shaking our whole house. We don't want to feel it. We want a complete package, not only from a noise control standpoint, but also on the room acoustic side of things. So we were able to go up there, and I say there was a team involved. There was a consultant involved in this, as well as our own folks involved. But we went up there, made some measurements, put some accelerometers down, and we discovered that there was a 17 hertz frequency that was coming into the structure from the train. So that's below human hearing. So this is something you could feel and not necessarily hear. So because of that, we were forced to use a spring system to isolate this equipment, because the spring system, as I mentioned before, can get down to 3 hertz if you have the right conditions involved. Normally, if you don't have something like a train nearby, we're going to go with a much less expensive pad system. We've done much more expensive theaters with pad systems, but in this case, because we had that very specific problem, we had to go with the spring system. So what's involved with that is your first step is you put down a plastic bond breaker. And on that bond breaker, you're going to put these cast iron canisters. You're going to connect those with rebar. You're then going to pour concrete and let it cure. Then you're going to come back, and there's these little lids on the canisters. You're going to throw those away, and then you're going to drop the right color spring in these little nooks and crannies, and then drop a steel lid on there, and then literally turn each screw 3 times, go to the next screw 3 times, go to the next canister 3 times, until you slowly lift that slab 2 inches off the ground. And you have to do it that way so you don't put stress in the slab as you're lifting it up. And this particular project, there was quite the engineering challenge because we had such a low forcing frequency at 17 hertz, we had to vent the floor, which is very unusual. And that just means, I always tell people, you have a bucket and you drop a lid in there that's the right size, it kind of floats down. We had to avoid that air entrapment, if you will. So the whole slab had to be vented, and then we had to build the walls and the ceiling on this slab. Additionally, they wanted to cantilever out where all the equipment went. And so our engineers had to get involved and actually figure out a way to do those attachment details and how that cantilever would go into our isolated floor. and then so on and so forth. So
well,
I remember
maybe
when
I
they
can
first...
just drop in with a question I had there. So, I mean, we've mentioned on our podcast the idea of constructing a room within a room. Now, this most definitely sounds like an extreme example of a room built inside of another room, where the floor on which everybody's going to be walking and your seats are going to go, I mean, that is completely separated by this spring system from the actual foundation of the house itself that exists below it. But you mentioned in most cases in homes, we're not going to be going to this completely isolated by springs floor system. We're going to be using one of the products that we showed earlier in the home section, which is, like a squishy underlayment essentially. One question I did have, because I've seen controversy about the system where it's the sort of squishy underlayment, your subfloor on top of that. Do the walls get built on top of the subfloor that's on top of the squishy thing? Or do the wall frames go on the original structure below that? Because I've seen arguments in both directions saying that, if you build it on top of the squishy thing, then you've got the true room within a room. But then I've seen it said sometimes that actually leads to more movement of this new structure that ends up transmitting sound even more than if you had just done the framing on the original structure of the building. So I'd love to get your take on that one.
Sure. The answer, I say, just plan for it. In fact, in this project, they were really, really, really concerned because they jacked this floor up and it was like a trampoline.
Yeah.
And they're saying, hey, this thing's moving all over the place. And we're like, yeah, because you haven't weighted it down yet.
Right.
Right.
In fact, we had to make sure they raised it up past where it was going to eventually be. And then the weight of the rest of it was going to make it settle and then everything quieted down. So my general point is, if you are going to pay to isolate your floor, take advantage of that and isolate your walls too. Build them on top of there. Just let us know, because we may have to stick a couple extra pads if we're doing a pad system. The continuous underlayments, those generally have a really high weight capacity, so you don't have to worry about there so much. It really just make sure we know what's going on, and if you've already paid for it, take advantage of it.
I think that's the key, because so often it's being asked from a DIY perspective. And so I think when someone's trying to give advice that is going out to a broad, general, non-specific audience, it can be very difficult to say this is going to work for sure when they don't know the specifics of what they're building. So, I mean, when Tom and I reach the limits of our knowledge, which we certainly get to before an engineer would, that's when we say, you need to talk to an engineer about this. You need to get the specifics and get the calculations, because we can say, here's the concept. Tom and I are pretty good at saying, here's the concept behind it, but the actual application to your specific project, when we're getting into this stuff, that's when we need to contact a company like yours.
And the other thing to keep in mind that people don't pay attention to is, if you have an isolated ceiling, you have an isolated floor, and your walls flank up around there, and they're hard attached, that's a flanking path. Your water is leaking. So you definitely either need to put an isolated on top of that, or separate those walls physically from there too. So you do need to take that into account. If you have existing walls, trying to fit it all inside there, if there is concern about that structural vibration getting into that house and breaking out however it's going to break out, it's something to just be aware of.
Great. So I interrupted the project. I think we were actually sort of getting to the interior of the project now. So
yes. So after we did clips on the walls to do the noise control side of it, as well as the vibration side, and then what they took advantage of. We if you call us up, we can run what we call a reverb calculator for you, and it's a calculator. It's not a model, where we look at the different absorption characteristics, say, of drywall and carpet. You just tell us what's in the room, and we will kind of mix and match a square footage of material that you need to bring that down to where a home theater should be, or whatever listening room you might have. The next step above that is, we do have a partnership with consultants that do a model. And what that model does, the difference is, it's actually going to look at your seating position and say, you need this type of absorber here, you're using this speaker, And they did that in this case. Additionally, in this case, they wanted this very elaborate wood framed separation thing. So we had to make very crazy shapes in our panels and put them up there. And this just screams for that stretch track system, because we're going to hide a whole lot of that ugly panels that are very, very specifically tuned. In this case, with the ceiling, they went with a Starfield ceiling that was a stretch system. So we just put the channels up. You might get 1 or 2 seams at the most, and it just hides all that stuff.
And stretch tracks basically is just an acoustically transparent fabric that you string up, along a wall or a ceiling or whatever to hide all the speakers and panels that are behind it, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Excellent.
Versus a regular ready-to-hang panel.
Right.
Yeah.
So in your graphic here and your PowerPoint, we've got this cantilever, and you mentioned that this was because they wanted to hide gear, but it also says on here that it was something that it was required for prevention of room modes. That seems to be an expensive way to fix room modes when you can kind of not do that at all and still have them basically be nullified by the use of proper placement of subwoofers and a little bit of DSP and EQ. So can you speak a little bit to why you guys chose or why the client, I suppose, was really the culprit here, chose to go through the extra expense of this cantilevered bump out in this one wall?
I think from a room mode perspective, most of it was trying to get it away from being square. It was just trying to get it to more of a rectangle shape. Also, I think they just wanted that room to be as big as it possibly could be. So I think it was more that necessarily than it was a specific room mode that we were concerned about.
Okay.
That makes sense.
That seemed like it seemed to be I was like, I mean, I don't know how much. What is it? Looks like 6. Look like maybe a foot. I mean, it doesn't even look like it's that much.
2'7" is
really okay. It's much bigger than it looks on this graphic.
Yeah.
But still, that's not a huge amount for bass waves when you consider the length of a bass wave.
So you've built this completely isolated room within a room, altered some dimensions, dressed it up inside. How do people get in and out of this room? On AVRant, we talk about sort of our favorite system if you have the complete room within a room, which is like an airlock system or an antechamber system where there's 2 doors. There's 2 doors. One will be for the inside portion, one will be for the outside, or like we say, an entire sort of antechamber waiting room outside that you can separate from the rest of the house. We see it mentioned here that there is an acoustical door, but we're like, is just one door? Is that going to be the weak point?
So we do manufacture a door. We do, and as well as seals and things of that nature. The challenge with doors is I talked about that airspace being critical between 2 layers of mass and that squishy element. Well, an 1 3/4 wide door is not going to really allow for a lot of that. So if you were to look at one of our doors naked, as it were, it is a lot of steel. It's about 10 pounds per square foot. It is wrapped in a veneer, and it is going to run you about $6,000.
Okay, all right. So I mean, in a way, you could sort of conceive that's a bit like having 2 doors in one. In fact, that and some, because it's right.
We often recommend that solid core door, but you guys took that solid core to heart. You didn't skimp around. You're like, yes, ours is filled with titanium. Thank you.
Well, and the sad part is, it still is the weak point in that wall.
It's an opening.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Tom, you want to take the next one there? Yeah.
Is it my turn? I don't even know where we are in these questions anymore. All right, so let me see here. There's a great interest in our audience in learning what is worthwhile when it comes to soundproofing construction, and where can reductions in costs and complexity be allowed while still achieving good results. So perhaps a simpler way to approach this would be, what's the, you walk in this, and I do this all the time when I walk into people's houses and I look at their terrible TVs and that are way too far from their couches, and motion smoothing is on and their itty bitty speakers off to the right. What's the minimum you can do in a room? Like I said, we're going back to that kind of rectangular. I managed to get a bedroom or a small, a small room off to the side of my house where I can put my little home theater with my one couch, but it's right next to my kids' bedrooms, or it's right next to my bedroom, or it's I want to try to keep sound from leaking out as much as I can. What's the minimum that you could, or not minimum? What would you do cost effectively if you were a DIYer, or maybe somebody who isn't opposed to paying for something, but clearly cannot afford to put or the space or the money to put a room within a room?
Sure. The first step I would do, let's assume these walls are existing and you can't tear anything down, because it is going to come down to that mass, airspace mass. The first step would be to add a layer of drywall on a side if you possibly can. And if you were to call us up and say, is there anything else I can do besides that? My question to you is, what's your stud spacing? If your stud spacing happens to be 24 inch on center, which is rarely the case, I would say it is worth putting a product like Sound Damp on that wall first, and then put an extra layer of drywall up.
And that's a constrained layer damping, right? That's like a viscoelastic type of layer that goes between the two layers of drywall?
Correct. So unlike where we're trying to stop that structure-borne vibration, this is working a little bit differently. It is actually changing the frequency at which that wall is going to resonate. So I tell people it's like ringing a bell and then putting your finger on the bell. So instead of clang, it goes clunk. However, to make that work, that's why you need that 24 inches of spacing, because you need that much mass of drywall for it to be effective. So most people are going to be at 16. I would say don't bother putting that up. Go ahead and put your layer of drywall directly on top of it. Now, the next step would be, okay, you're going to let me tear down a layer of drywall. What I would say, your first and least expensive noise control is put very inexpensive, low pound per cubic foot density fiberglass fluff in the wall. Very light density. You don't have to buy the fancy stuff that's rated. I will say, up in Canada, y'all are more mineral wool people.
We've got a lot of rock wool. Yep.
Yeah, and they swear up and down that they do better on lower frequencies. And as soon as they send me a test, I will parrot that as well, because I don't have a dog in that fight. So it might be better to use mineral wool if they claim it does. That's your first and cheapest. Then there's a product out there called Resilient Channel. And it looks like a continuous layer. Putting that up with a layer of drywall can be effective. Just make sure, there's different brands out there. You need to pick the right brand. And more importantly is to make sure you install it not upside down, and you don't put the screws in the wrong place. It's really, really,
and don't put it upside down so it compresses and ends up pushing against the stud anyway. You've just wasted all that money.
Yep, I've been on job sites where they said, we know how we're building it, and I'll count 1, 2, 3. And he's, are you counting channel? I'm like, no, ways you've done it wrong. They do that. Then I would say add 2 layers to that if you possibly can. And so that's your, before you want to call Kinetics, least expensive way to do that. From there, I would call us up, and I would say the best bang for the buck product we have is our Isomax clip. If you look at its performance versus, say, a double stud wall, it's about the same. And it gets rid of a stud, and instead of taking up 10 inches of space, it only takes up 7.5 inches of space. So it really is a magical effect. If I'm on a commercial side and an architect says, I only have 30 seconds to talk to you, I say, do you do double stud construction? They say yes. I say, well, you shouldn't, because it's actually cheaper to do this.
Well, certainly in terms of once you're calculating cost per square foot, in terms of like what they can sell the room, like what square footage is this house, you're saving square footage on that system versus, I mean, the double stud is getting pretty darn close to the isolated room within a room. That's where that ends up heading if you do that. One of the questions we get all the time, in fact, we have a question we're going to be answering on just next week's regular AVRant question and answer podcast. It's the classic thing of my room is not enclosed. I don't have a door. Maybe it's the living room that's open to, the kitchen or something like that. My bedroom's right upstairs. Can I just put another layer of drywall on the ceiling, and that's going to let me blast my theater and not wake up my wife at night?
Maybe if your wife wears earplugs and you've isolated your bed. I don't know. No, I mean,
isolating the bed's not a bad idea. We need to put that in the toolbox. We need to talk about that.
It's actually crazy. I read studies on how some of these power generating windmills are such a low frequency that literally if you move your head to where your feet are, you won't hear it or feel it. But if you flip around, you will. So, I mean, it's crazy like that kind of thing. But no, I mean, doubling your mass does actually do a decent dB drop, but it's probably not going to be anywhere near what you want it to do, especially for if there's a subwoofer involved. It's just not going to treat to that low of frequencies effectively.
Yeah, going a little bit off script here, but it's one of those things where we struggle all the time to convey that it's not that there is zero audible difference if you do that. I think that's what you're saying. You know, if you have that sort of open room, you do double up the ceiling, or maybe you even take the existing ceiling down, you do resilient channel or sound clip and hat channel, and put a new ceiling up. It's not that does nothing. It will be a little bit more muffled and quieter than just the, you know, one layer of drywall that was there. But because the room is open, obviously you can't fully soundproof. So we struggle to convey, are you getting your money's worth? It's really tough for us to answer that. If we can get an expert and third opinion on that, it would help us out.
It really is going to come down to exactly how that sound is going to travel out of that space. I mean, an open wall is an open wall, you know. Now, that said, if you have a window and a wall that's treated otherwise, there isn't still advantage to treating that wall. The overall sound is lower, even if you have a hole in that space. It is going to matter. Would I do a second layer of drywall and that's it? It really depends how much my wife complained, I guess, or how much I was going to.
The way I kind of describe
up.
it is, it's much like instead of, you know, letting the faucet run over you, you put your hands up and try to hold some of it back. You will get some of it, and it will slow down the stream, but you're still going to get wet. And you know, I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to here,
especially at the lower frequencies that are going to be bothersome. Yeah.
Right. So you guys do a lot of HVAC work. You've mentioned that a couple times already on the commercial side and the home theater side. One of the flanking paths that we're always talking to people about is HVAC, because, you know, your air return is usually under your door, which they're like, well, I could just block that. I'm like, yeah, but do you wanna? It might get a little warm in there. You might need some O2. You know, so, and then one of the flanking paths for sound to get out, of course, is HVAC. And your AC or your heat allow sound to pass through to the other parts of your house. So what's some of the products or some of the solutions for that type of noise control?
So when you look at a HVAC system in general, there's a lot of potential problems and a lot of different types of solutions that are quite different from each other. Starting with the unit itself, we may need to isolate that because it might be getting into your structure and causing vibration from getting in that way. Not typical, but that does happen. And sometimes that equipment is even so strong that it might make the ducts in themselves vibrate. We can isolate those if we have to with hangers. Again, not very, very typical. More typical is that sound escaping, like you said, either through the return or through the supply. And you can add a silencer, if you will. I think car muffler. That really is what it is. It's an amazing product. If I could ever do a demo, you can literally see the speaker and not hear it coming out the other side. It's an amazing thing. Typically, those are installed outside of the theater itself. The challenge, though, once you do that, when you run, say, that supply side in, you still have a diffuser, and you also are typically cutting a hole in this isolated ceiling. You've eliminated the mass. So we often have to take that mass-loaded vinyl I mentioned earlier and wrap that around that ductwork, as well as potentially treat the back of that diffuser. As far as those diffusers go from the air noise itself, we don't manufacture a product for that, but generally speaking, if you get those long, thin ribbon type, those tend to not be as audible as the square audio coming, or the square whooshing sound, as you will, the typical kind. So
again, that's one where we definitely like to say, if you want to properly address soundproofing when it comes to the HVAC, talk to an HVAC specialist. But I think where it really helps for someone to be armed with the knowledge that you just gave is at least someone can ask about that now, because not every HVAC specialist is a soundproofing specialist. You know, they might know exactly how to get what, you know, cubic feet per minute you need in airflow, but not necessarily the sound isolation side of it, or especially isolating bass frequencies like we've just been talking about. You know, getting the vocal range, there's a lot we can do to muffle that relatively inexpensively, but getting the bass is always a challenge. So once people are armed, at least they can ask about it and find someone who can do it properly. So, I mean, speaking of treating the acoustics inside of the room, that's the other side of it. You've mentioned that, you know, the products that Kinetics has for the home market, it is insulation based. There's also composite based. You have combo panels, the TAD panels that are a combination of absorption and diffusion. You have diffusion products as well. So we get this all the time, but again, we'd love to get another person's take on it. You know, what is maybe we'll start at the bottom on this one. What's sort of the minimum that's worthwhile? Are we just going to throw in a couple of bass traps? You have a really interesting product, the Versatune low frequency, which is almost like a combination of insulation and tuned membrane to really get that crossover frequency, the 80-90 hertz range specifically, which can be difficult to do without a physically very thick panel. So what's the starting point, and then, you know, basically what are the steps? Do this first, then this type of thing.
Sure. So, you know, again, I kind of mentioned that reverb program we would do. That is definitely that's a free service we have. The dealers can run it, the reps can run it, we can run it for you, just to kind of say this is where you are and this is where you should be, because you do have to look at your room. You do want to treat a room that's got a carpeting finish much differently than you would a wood floor. Because generally speaking, that carpet's going to do a really, really good job of knocking down that high frequency and leaving behind the low and mid frequency tones. You watch a lot of, you know, YouTube channels, you'll see people swear like, oh, if you've got carpeting, just put a little rug up and that's all you need to do. You'll ruin it with acoustic panels. They're not necessarily wrong. If you use a typical that's 6 pound per cubic foot density board, it's all high frequency absorption. You probably don't want to add any of that if you've got carpet in the room. Worse yet, I see a lot of do-it-yourself videos where they say use a 3 pound per cubic foot. That's even worse, because that's all high frequency. Now, that said, if you've got hardwood or if you've got wood floors in there, which is not typical, but if you do, a lot of times we see you do need to add a little bit of that to the mix, because you do have so much high frequency bouncing around in there. So it really isn't necessarily something, I mean, you can, if you really want to geek out and go through and look at all our charts and graphs, that's why we test them. That's what you can do all in to figure that yourself, or just call us, because that's a pretty easy. It is a first step, but generally speaking, it can start with just a handful of panels and go on up. What I hope we get out, you know, don't just throw in, especially like a 1-inch thick panel everywhere. You see that all over the internet. 1-inch thick panels are never going to treat low frequencies. They just can't. Or the
egg crate foam. Avoid the egg crate foam. That's not going to help your crossover.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't think we're having any disagreements there, so that's very nice to hear.
So you did mention earlier that you have a new house and a nice basement space that will be eventually kitted out with, I'm sure, Kinetics control.
One would think.
Gear. So what's the plan? What you got? What's? I'm sure you've been foaming at the mouth to put something in there. So what's your plan? What you gonna do?
The plan first is I want to get an electrician in there, because I got a hobby barn that's taking up a lot of my capacity. I'm a little concerned about being able to do what I want to do in here, because it's all in one 20 amp fuse for the whole basement. Right. I have 2,100 square feet of stuff to play with here. But kind of looking at the space and everything else, I'm going to have to put the theater underneath my sunken living room, unfortunately, which means my ceiling height is definitely not ideal. For sure. I have plenty of length. I can probably go 30 feet deep if I want to, but I'm going to be hard on my width at 13 feet.
If you have limited height, then 30 feet long with multiple rows of tiered seating could have some people hunching down in that back row.
Yeah.
Only the kids can sit in the back.
or I can, chisel out the basement floor and make it
There you
deeper.
go.
Yeah,
Cantilever.
I'm going to be stuck that way. And I'm also got a hard stop about 13 feet width, and I'm definitely concerned about that too. So from what I am going to do, and I do live alone, so my noise is my noise. It's not going to bother
helps.
anybody.
You know what? There's the easiest soundproofing ever,
There
honestly.
you go, right there. Don't make the mistake I did and get married and have kids. Holy moly. They are a real cramp in the home theater style. Everybody's got an opinion about this room. And I'm like, listen, this is not your room. Get out. Get out of here. No one asked you to come in here.
It does drive me crazy that my young nephew, who I adore, has noise sensitivity issues.
Oh no!
Like, put those earmuffs on. I'm still going to shake you, kind of thing. So what the plan will be from a treatment standpoint is I will treat the entire ceiling with our Versatune product, which is low on the high frequencies and a little bit upper on the 100 hertz kind of range. On my walls, I will treat those walls with our VTLF. I don't want to put that everywhere because I'm going to have carpet. I'm going to put that everywhere that I need to from a square foot standpoint. I don't know. I haven't done the math yet on how that's going to work out. Frankly, I think that's where that VTLF is going to fit very, very, very nicely. Is if you've got carpet, that's probably the only acoustic panel you probably need. Unfortunately, all the data out there what we have for drywall and things like that doesn't go below 100 hertz. So it's kind of hard to give you a calculator on how that's going to work. Additionally, even though I don't have room on my ceiling to put a noise control device, I am actually going to use those clips, those Isomax clips I mentioned, on my walls and around. And here's why. There's a secret. It's not even on our website. Is we actually tested that as an absorber just for kicks. And we found that I think you used the term diaphragmatic absorber. I think that's a very good term to use. And believe it or not, it has crazy absorption at 40 hertz, 50 hertz, and 63.
Okay.
So what that's going to mean, now, unfortunately, there's not a standard that I can say that your room is tight and your bass is going to sound awesome. But if there was that standard, the Isomax clip as a treatment along with that VTLF means I'm cutting everything below by the other treatment I'm going to do. So bang for the buck. I'm not doing it for noise control. I'm doing it just purely for making that room sound really, really good.
And it sounds as though your floor won't have to be raised on springs in this installation.
No.
Well, even if it does, the house is just going to have to shake.
All right.
Yeah. So this is a very good point. And I don't know who all is going to be listening to this podcast, because I know, a lot of your clients and dealers, are going to be listening in. But for our listeners, I think that they have this kind of idea that your professionals within the industry, they've all got these no holds barred theater rooms that is, absolutely, kitted out with everything. And here you are as somebody who has full access to all these noise control products and, and everything and room treatments and everything else. And you're like, well, I can only go 13 feet and my ceiling's too low, so I can only do this. I'm like, exactly. We've all got limitations within that we have to work, and that limits what we can do, no matter what we have access to.
Yep.
So it's kind of a nice reminder that even though you may be out there saying to yourself, I wish I had a dedicated room. Well, for a long time, I wish I had a dedicated room. Yep. I finally got one, and I'm happy about it. But I lived that your life for a very long time, so it's really nice to hear that. What else do you want to talk about? We've kind of addressed all of our questions, I think, unless I missed one, which is possible because I'm not really following this script I've got here.
We did pretty good, I think, and we have reached the hour. So Jason's been very, very generous with his time. But if you are willing, if there's anything else that we didn't ask about that you wanted to touch upon, we're very happy to hear it.
I think the one thing I would add on, if someone is out there shopping for these acoustical panels, you're going to see the abbreviation NRC, which is noise reduction coefficient. And I'd like to do a little bit of education on that if I can. That standard only measures from 250, 500, 1,000, and 2,000 hertz. Very, very, very narrow range. I would call it basically the female voice ranges if I was going to put a number on that. So my point would be, with a home theater device, you may be going below 20 hertz. Looking at something that from an NRC standpoint it can be bad. It can be that high frequency absorber. It might not be something you want. That's pretty common knowledge. You can kind of figure that out if you go on the internet and read some things. What you might not understand about NRC is there's different ways it's mounted in the testing chamber. Okay. The most conservative way to do that is called A-mounting. Most of our tests are A-mounted. And all that means is there's 72 square feet of material resting on the floor in the chamber. And you get what you get out of that number. I see all these foam products that are marketed as bass traps all the time, where you'll see NRC numbers at 1.7 and 1.8. And first of all, that's bad for a bass trap. I mean, you don't want a high NRC number. You want it to be, our VTLF is an NRC of like 0.35. Right. And then, and I'd have it lower than that.
It's not a vocal trap, it's a bass trap.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also guarantee you that was called J-mounting. And J-mounting basically means you better read the report, because they're trying to test it as they're going to test it. So unless you're actually duplicating what they're doing for that, those are really bad numbers. And I also guarantee, like, when we are testing, we're working on some, I'll call them real bass trap. Now, these are low specific frequency things. We ran a room mode at the lab and made sure we put those things exactly where they needed to be for best performance. I guarantee you everybody else is doing that too. So when you're out there reading things, first of all, discard NRC. It's maybe a nice starting point. Look for the full test, look for the full frequencies, and again, balance it with what's in your room. And just understand, if they don't tell you how it's mounted, assume it was in a non-conservative way.
Not to open a whole new can of worms, but STC for sound transmission class runs into some of those issues too. If you're just comparing STC numbers, again, the bass is what's so darn tricky, because the STC numbers probably going to give you a pretty good idea of blocking the vocal range. That's often what's being tested there. But if you're trying to block the 30 hertz, the 40 hertz kick drum, STC, just comparing that across websites probably isn't going to tell you what's actually going to happen in your room. Or at least that's my understanding. You can confirm or tell me I'm completely wrong about that.
Not only does SEC not measure below 125, it's biased toward high frequencies, because that is where we're more sensitive to hearing. So that's why they do that. And frankly, all these standards are pretty young in the world of science. And the other problem with it is the labs have to be physically large to measure low wavelengths. So they just said, we'll just do this before there was such a thing as subwoofers, and this is our standard, and here we go.
Well, that is fantastic. Can't thank you enough for taking the time today. Know you're busy and took this out of a work day, and so that's wonderful, and our audience appreciates it. Hopefully it's useful to people that you're going to share it with as well. We've pretty much scratched the surface. We wanted to throw out a wide net, cover a lot of topics, get people interested, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss it further, maybe get some very, very specific and nerdy questions at some point, because that tends to happen.
Yeah, that's coming.
Those are always fun. Sure.
If you hear this podcast and the next two podcasts, well, not the next podcast after this one, but the one after that one, almost certainly is going to have questions about this interview, because they're going to be coming. They're going to be coming for sure.
But in the meantime, how can people reach out to you, or at least learn more about Kinetics Noise Control?
So our website is kineticsnoise.com. I would suggest looking for that home and home theater section, because we try to little layman's terms a lot of times on that particular website, even though there's the same products are on the other. If you want to reach out to us directly, a great email would be home@kineticsnoise.com, because that goes to multiple people here so we all can see it. So if someone is on vacation, we can cover it that way.
Excellent.
Great. Well, Jason, we want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk with us. And, don't be surprised if we reach out to you again and with some questions, because I'm sure we will. And it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Well, I appreciate it very much. Had a great time, and bring those questions on.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
That was our interview with Jason Ehrlich. I think I said it right for the first time ever.
One of these days.
You know, I should have this right, because it reminds me of A Knight's Tale, right?
Okay.
Ehrlich von Liechtenstein or something.
Is that
was
what
his
it was?
character?
I don't remember.
The fake
I
name.
remember the
Yes,
movie, but I don't
should
remember the
know
name.
this. That's like one of my wife's favorite movies. I've probably seen it a dozen times. So, anyways, Jason Ehrlich from Kinetics Noise Control. Great having him on the podcast. You heard a lot of very interesting information. And one of the things I found kind of telling is something that happens a lot in a lot of industries, where it's like, we know that this is the case because we've measured it a little bit and we've had experience with it, but it's not something that's peer reviewed and published, so we can't really talk about it. It's not something we can brag about because it's or market because it's not.
We don't necessarily have the facts and figures to back it up.
Right. Well, I mean, he was talking about his the vibrating walls, where that actually acts as an absorber for really low frequencies, which is actually kind of interesting, and I never really thought about it. The key there, of course, and I think the key takeaway for me is, yes, it can all be done. It's not necessarily, the products themselves aren't necessarily all that expensive,
right?
But you could see how things can go horribly awry. So he was talking about his the system for raising the floor, and how if you were looking at the YouTube video, you could see how those things basically they put plastic down, they pour with these little. These sound things in there, and then once they put the rebar down in the concrete, then they have to raise the whole thing up slowly by turning the screws, which sounds nerve-wracking because that concrete cracks and you're just starting from scratch. So yeah, the products might not cost that much, but the proper installation,
yes,
and
it is how they are deployed.
It is so important here, because any mistake means it doesn't work. Which is the same when you're building, and when we keep talking about water, it's the same when you're building a boat, right? I mean, anybody can put together something that looks like a boat, but it might sink to the bottom of the ocean the minute you put it in some water. You need somebody who knows what they're doing. So that's the same with soundproofing. And, he clearly is much more worried about the lower bass frequencies, in the mid.
That's the
most
really
people
challenging stuff.
Yeah.
It's what we deal with all the time, and particularly in home theater. I mean, we get the crowd all the time here, spending lots of money on massively powerful subwoofers that can go into the infrasonic range, have output capabilities honestly beyond what their room actually requires. But hey, we love that stuff. It's a little bit of gear lust, and we're fine with that because it's fun and it makes you feel good. But then you realize, hey, if I'm actually going to let this thing run free and get those 115 decibel output levels that I've been lusting after, I have to be concerned about the people around me, the other members of my household. Maybe I've got attached neighbors. So dealing with all of that, what I think really stood out to me in this interview, and what I was very, very happy to hear, is that the basic concepts behind this stuff, I don't think is actually that complicated.
No.
Like I mentioned in the interview itself, it's shock absorption for the most part. That's not a tremendously difficult concept to wrap your head around, but actually doing it correctly, that's where Tom and I can get you to, hey, now we get the concept. When it comes to really working it out, we're happy to have a company that we can now point people to, like Kinetics, to say, hey, they can help you with the actual calculation or get you to the dealer who can do the physical installation of this stuff, because there is a bit of a gap in, I think he detailed it really well, between where DIY makes sense if it's I'm adding a layer of drywall, or maybe I'm taking the existing drywall down, putting in some insulation, maybe even some resilient channel. That's all DIY. Once you get to, no, I've got to actually cantilever out this floor, or I've got to truly construct a room within a room, or I need to address the HVAC, which I wouldn't be keen to touch on a DIY basis.
Right.
That's where we need to reach out to the experts. So really happy to have a resource like this.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. One of my takeaways was, if you have a room within a room, you don't need to decouple your subwoofers. because
well, except for the acoustics within the room itself, there's still going to be some of that going on. Yeah.
As long as nothing is rattling, like physically rattling because of it, you can literally shake your entire room with your massive subwoofers, Rob.
Right.
If you have a room within a room, like you could literally shake the room. Can I just tell you that that he was talking about his steel door, and I was like, I could use a steel door, and then he told me it was $6,000. I'm like, I can't afford a steel door. Holy moly, that's awesome.
That's where our solution of 2 solid core doors is more cost effective, although it probably takes up a little bit more space, but
or maybe a lot more space. All right, again, we want to thank Jason for coming on the podcast. It was great to talk to him. It was extremely informative. One of the dangers of having interviews, in my mind, is there are people who are just painful to listen to, and he was a joy. You know what I mean?
You know what? We've done really well in our very limited amount of interviews that we've done. Everybody has been super friendly, super kind, super personable.
You would think we had screened these people, but we have just gotten lucky because believe me, we don't screen anybody.
Caution.
There's nothing like a call-in show on the radio that make me turn the channel because I cannot stand that. But he was great to talk to. I'm hoping we can have him back sometime. And certainly, if you've got any questions, you now have if specifically for him or for his company, you now have an email address to reach him at. If you want to ask a question on this podcast, feel free to email us at question@avrant.com. Again, we have episodes that come out every week, apparently on Thursdays now. That's a new thing that's happening. This one's not coming out on Thursday. I can tell you that much.
By request of an acoustics expert, so I can't say
That's
no.
right. That's right. Herb told us to turn it off on Fridays, and now we can't have it on Fridays anymore.
You know what?
Herb said no.
We were remiss. Jason definitely knows Herb from Cross Spectrum Acoustics.
Right.
We've been friends with Herb from Cross Spectrum Acoustics for years at this point, online friends. And thankfully, I finally got the chance to meet him in person as well. So we all know each other, at least in the online world. So we didn't even get to that, but we had a lot to talk about with Jason. So I'm sure we can mention that next time.
That's right. All right, for AVRant, I'm Tom Antry.
And I'm Rob H. Now stay in and listen to something.
Want your question answered? Send it to question@avrant.com. This is AVRant.
Now go out and listen to something.